Gather round, all of you who would listen. I have a tale to tell. A story of warriors and kings. A saga of dark magic.
Well, we ended the last Hidden Gems video with the Mark of Cree, so we might as well start this one with its sequel, which in some ways is a superior game. Story-wise, it blows the first one away. The first one had a great story, and especially within the style that story was told, that's what really sold it more than the actual narrative itself. But this one takes it to a whole new level, with part of the game actually taking place a decade before the events of Mark of Cree, where you'll play as his trainer and another character, and then part of the game will also take place 10 years after the events of Mark of Cree, where we'll be playing the protagonist from the first game, along with his younger sister, who is now full-grown and a warrior that in some ways is even more brutal than he is. All the brilliance of the mechanics of the first game return, and there's even a little bit added as you're constantly between both parts of the storyline accompanied by an additional character. This new implementation of having two characters in each level at once rather than the solo run of the first game is a bit of a double-edged sword. It adds a lot more to character interaction and adds a lot more to the story in itself, but it's fraught with some other issues. The first game had a great feel with that one individual character, especially when you're getting into the stealth mechanics and the puzzle solving. For some reason, just being that one solely focused character worked really well. This one, in expanding it to two characters, you lose a little bit of that focus, and there are definite issues with the AI with your computer controlled character. It's far from perfect. This could have been fixed with something that I think would have made this game far and beyond better than the first one, would have made it an absolute classic. There should be a multiplayer option where you could have a second player come in and take control of the other character. That would have really made this game an instant classic. It would have been incredible. But the lack of that feature really hurts it, because you're always required to be with this second character, and sometimes dying because of something the computer does, everyone knows that is a huge issue. But in a game like this, it's so action heavy, it can be even more frustrating. But aside from that issue of your AI controlled counterpart and the lack of a multiplayer mode, overall this game is just about in every way equal to the first, and a fantastic follow-up. Overall, I definitely prefer the first overall, but I think that comes more to just personal taste rather than quality. Gungrave. This is one badass action shoot-'em-up. Like the game says, kick their ass. Tear your way through stages absolutely packed with baddies, leading into awesome creative boss fights. Gungrave has a very appealing anime aesthetic that it uses throughout. It keeps the original Japanese voice work, has one hell of a rocking soundtrack, and is just one cool game. This is one game that really takes on that word and all its meaning. This is one badass cool game by Red Entertainment and published in North America by almighty Sega. On the surface, it would seem like just a button mashing shoot 'em up. You go through almost like a arcade game in a way, but it actually weaves a pretty interesting dark story as you go along. It's pretty amazing. If you've ever seen the anime, which is I think more popular, the game actually came first, the original Gungrave game. It's something that I think got passed by because of the first impression of the game. It seems stylistically cool, but not quite as complex and elegant as something like Devil May Cry, and the really fascinating storyline isn't immediately apparent. You go through multiple stages in a very arcade fashion. If you're less inclined to play something that has fluidly connected levels and you're more interested in sort of an arcade style level by level structure, then this is more for you. It's a ton of fun like that. I love going through in different difficulty modes and trying to get new high scores, learning new abilities, and in between each level you get a little bit more storyline, either through anime cutscenes or your rest point where you can talk at your home base and save. The main character is Beyond the Grave, and he is really cool. A big, hulking, lumbering, undead being with his giant coffin attached to the back of his arms by chains, and he just seems so, even in the way he controls, he seems so heavy and hulking, but he can be fairly nimble if you learn to control him right. All kinds of jumping and flipping around while you're shooting, while he does seem to just kind of lumber along, you have to learn to be able to dodge rocket shots and maneuver your way around hordes of enemies. And he doesn't just have his guns at his disposal, but he can swing that coffin around to deal lots of heavy melee damage. And the controls are fantastic because you really feel the weight of your movements, you feel the swing of the coffin. And one of my favorite elements throughout the entire game is when you're rapid fire shooting your guns, you can feel it. It feels and sounds almost like a war drum pounding in front of you. And it just has such a satisfying sensation to those controls. And it's just a blast to play, incredible fast-paced arcadey fun. You get to unlock all kinds of really cool special moves that not only look cool, but they have different purposes. Some to spin around and clear a room with lots of little baddies, some that are rockets aimed more towards singular, stronger foes. Interesting boss fights, cool level structure, a great mix of some arcade action with something that is undeniably going to be compared to Devil May Cry. And in stating that, over the years, 15 years ago, my teenage self would never have even considered saying this, but over time, while it's not quite as polished and not quite as complex and doesn't require quite the level of skill, doesn't have quite the learning curve as something like Devil May Cry 1 and 3, over the years, I've actually come back to Gungrave more. It's just more straight fun. I think Devil May Cry is a more challenging experience. I do think it is a very totally different experience, though. I think if you just want to have an absolute blast blazing your way through hundreds of enemies with a really cool anime aesthetic, a super badass soundtrack, an interesting main character, Gungrave is your ticket. Next up is the surprise sequel, Gungrave Overdose. I say surprise because Gungrave didn't really sell well enough to justify a sequel, but I think with the success of the anime, it was a more successful franchise as a whole than just the first game by itself. Gungrave has a bigger, if not better, story than the original one, with close to an hour worth of anime cutscenes, and this time now 3 characters to choose from. The controls are very much the same, but there are some good and bad differences. One, Beyond the Grave himself has a very different feel to him. The game as a whole is much more agile and fast-paced. You don't have that really heavy hulking feeling, and in some ways it's good because it feels like a more acrobatic experience, but it loses something in the transition, I think. However, it is just as fun. It just feels a little bit different, and I think is missing a little bit that appealed to the aesthetic of the first game. I think there's definitely a different feel to Overdose. The one advantage it has, though, are the 3 characters, so the game has much more replayability, much more variety by playing through 3 different characters with very different styles. On top of that, in some ways, the game almost looks visually worse. Again, everything looks a little more sleek, a little more smooth and streamlined, and adds to that much more fast pace to this game. But at the same time, it's missing a lot of the heavy colors and tones and the deep shadows in many cases. And I'm not quite as big of a fan of the character designs in this and some of the boss designs as compared to the first game. So I think visually it's not quite as appealing. Story-wise, it's up in the air, but for me personally, I like the first game better as well. Soundtrack-wise, they're pretty even with each other, but gameplay-wise, I think it's just personal taste. In some ways, the first game's better. In some ways, the second game is far and beyond better. So overall, it's just personal taste, but it is a great follow-up and a must-have if you like the original Gungrave, and I think this sequel is even more unknown than the first game. Next up is one that I will be amazed if you've ever even heard about this game. It's actually a combination of 2 long-running, mostly arcade series in Japan that we, to my knowledge, have not received any entries of either of them in the US. The Nightmare of Juraga, one that I particularly like because I'm a big Namco fan, and that's mixed with Fushigi No Dungeon, and the 2 of them are somewhat similar in their style and gameplay. dungeon versus like a tower, I guess, is the most basic kind of way to explain that. But combining them together makes a really unique and interesting experience that I haven't found anything quite like it on the PS2. It's basically a turn-based dungeon crawler that mixes a whole lot of puzzle work, and it's a great fusion of a real arcade feel to the stages mixed with a more traditional roguelike that you'd think of on a console or PC. So it has a really cool fusion of those two to create an interesting package, and one that, as I said, if anyone's even heard of this game, I'd be amazed. The game is notable in that the dungeons are largely randomly generated, and it does have a very steep difficulty curve, and it's very unforgiving. When you die, you lose nearly all your items and half your gold. It really keeps a lot of the more interesting hardcore aesthetics of the games that it is birthed from, plus the traditional roguelike features that I think you'll be more familiar with. Rise to Honor rocks. I have no idea why this wasn't a bigger hit. It is absolutely fantastic. Anyone who I've had sit down and play this game absolutely loved it, and they're like, why have I not heard of this game? If you like 80s and 90s Hong Kong action, John Woo, Jackie Chan, Jet Li, whoever, if you like that era and those styles of films, this is more of a playable Hong Kong action flick than any other game I've ever played. It fits that mold perfectly. It feels like a playable Hong Kong action movie, and it gets the authenticity right. It even has a Cantonese language option for the part of the game where you're in Hong Kong. It takes place part in Hong Kong and part in the US, and that's right, it actually has Cantonese, not English dub, not a Mandarin dub, Cantonese when you're in Hong Kong, and that's just a great example of the general aesthetic and the nature of this game that's so true to that type of presentation. It feels like a perfect playable Hong Kong action flick starring Jet Li. It gets his movements down perfectly from a lot of his movies of that era, and it controls, I'd say, for me, flawlessly. Some people don't like the control mechanics. I absolutely love it. I think it's incredibly original and dynamic. Instead of having attack buttons on the face buttons, you control movement with the left analog stick, and it has sort of a flick attack system where the majority of your moves are controlled just by flicking the right analog stick in the direction of your opponents. And as you flick it in different patterns or swing it around to do spin attacks on the ground, you end up unlocking different combinations, and depending how you move around, you attack in different ways. You can interact in the environment by leaping off walls, kicking people into objects, throwing objects, smashing and leaping through windows. And there's even a really interesting gunplay mechanic, which isn't used as heavily as the hand-to-hand combat, but it's still a very fun mechanic, and you can enter sort of that John Woo, like jump in slow motion and shoot things in the distance, and explosions and birds flying everywhere. But one of the greatest things is the level design. It has such a perfect continuous flow and forward momentum as there's a lot of levels where you're running and chasing people and having to work your way through mazes of enemies and obstacles, jumping, leaping up walls, climbing ladders. You're fighting people with some tremendous Hong Kong action. The game is absolutely perfect in the aesthetic appeal, the storyline. I won't spoil anything for you here, but the storyline, it feels kind of like a standard film of the time, but it works really well in the context of this game. It's one of those things that's good enough and it gets all the points right, or even though it is somewhat of a generic story of that time, it works perfectly in this context. The gameplay is fantastic. There's some great boss fights. I really urge you to play this game. I'm trying to keep footage from just the first couple areas of the game here, but later on you get some awesome boss fights, and it's just an absolutely downright fantastic game. It's such a fun time. If you are into action games and if you're into Hong Kong action movies from the 80s and 90s, this game is right up your alley, and I have no idea why this game didn't sell well.